Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for understanding the delays. We finished our House votes, and we will have, I think, some of our members returning for questioning as well. I have a question for each of you. Dr. Rogerson, I believe you're familiar with the 2010 CRS report that referred to the study you co-authored in 2006, published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. Do you think the CRS report correctly stated the findings of your study?
Absolutely not. The quote that I read in it was basically the complete opposite of what we claimed our findings were.
Yeah, that was my understanding. In fact, when we asked CRS about this at our last hearing, they admitted their report was in error. They then proceed to give us another description of your study. You may be familiar with it. Do you agree with their latest description?
I do not. I have read their report and personally find it quite puzzling to try and make sense of the arguments being made in relation to what we've done. In particular, our study and the testimony I presented today are very clear about the important role of how tax revenues are used to return to the language of kind of intermediate micro. There's income and substitution effects. If you tax somebody, there's an income and a substitution effect. When you give it back as a transfer, that undoes the income effect. You're left with a substitution effect. And that's critical to the results, and they do not seem to appreciate that.
Well, be aware, I think CRS ought to be accurate, especially in describing other studies. So we're going to be asking for a correction, or at least an acknowledgement that in future papers that your study is described accurately. People read these, they count on them, it matters. So thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Dr. Biggs, in your testimony you said Social Security payroll taxes cannot be viewed in isolation. Key point, benefits also have to be considered. On a lifetime basis, you say benefits are equal to 78% of the taxes paid for or paid by a typical couple. But for those nearest retirement, additional benefits are equal to only about 2.5% of the additional taxes paid. Do you think there is any evidence that workers are aware of that significant disparity?
Well, there's been some work done looking at how well individuals understand the Social Security rules, and they understand them a little bit better than my gut would tell me would be the case, because the Social Security benefit formula is extremely complicated, and so no one can understand that in full. In the general incentives, though, I think they do understand, and when I was at Social Security, I would occasionally talk to people. They say, they would ask you, what am I going to get if I continue working? And the answer I'd have to give them is, well, pretty much nothing. I mean, your benefit will be increased by to account for the fact that you're delaying claiming, but the taxes you pay between today and the eventual date of retirement, very few people are going to get very much of that back.
Do you think overall they understand it in a general sense?
Well, I think they do, yeah.
You know,
and their
as
behavior
opposed to-
reflects that.
Explain that a little further. And their behavior reflects that.
Well, I mean, if you go back to 1950, the typical person claimed Social Security benefits around 68. Today, they claim them earlier, and there's been changes in the benefit rules, which I think would help push that. But I think there's just a kind of a gut feeling of, what am I getting out of this? And when people are younger, I mean, younger folks in particular don't think they're getting very much out of Social Security, but they don't have much choice. That if you want to eat, you have to work, and so they're going to try to work regardless. When somebody's in a situation where they can retire, though, if they don't feel the system is paying them back in exchange for what they're paying into it, they're going to take that option to retire. One point I would make about thinking about our budget solutions going forward is that raising the Social Security payroll tax rate could exacerbate this, in the sense that if you raise Social Security taxes, people's after-tax earnings are going to be lower, and for near retirees, the Social Security benefit they could get is going to look more attractive relative to what they could get by working. So by doing that, we could push more people into retirement. So there's going to be difficult choices involved with Social Security reform, but we have an aging population. If there are things we can do to keep people on the job and keep them working, that's good for the economy, it's good for the federal budget, and most of all, it's good for the people who do it.
Well, can I follow up on that? In your testimony, one way You suggest one way to increase employment would be to eliminate the payroll tax for older workers. The obvious objection, which you identified as well, is the potential loss of revenue. Other people have suggested we raise the retirement age. The obvious objection there is most people want to retire sooner rather than later, even though they're living longer. So what about both? In your view, what would be the offset of linking your payroll tax elimination to an increase in the age of eligibility?
Well, you could do transfers from the rest of the budget back to Social Security. In my testimony, I point out that the increases in federal income taxes, federal Medicare taxes, and state income taxes would roughly compensate for the reduction in Social Security revenues. So you could simply make transfers from the rest of the budget back to Social Security. Alternately, you could...
So the offset is not clear, obviously not within the mandatory side of it, but it's in the general revenue.
That's correct.
From the economic growth that comes
So
from
under Social Security, by cutting the payroll tax rate, will lose revenue. The question is, how much other revenue do you gain? Do you want to compensate Social Security back for it? I would tend to think you would. Things like raising the retirement age, those will also encourage people to work longer. There's evidence that as the retirement age has shifted from 65 to 66, more people have targeted that age 66 retirement age. So I believe in sending a whole range of signals to people that says, you need to work longer, but we want you to work longer. The raising the retirement age is sort of the stick of saying that if you don't work longer, you're going to get a lower benefit. Cutting the payroll tax rate is the carrot. It says to individuals, it also says to employers, we want you to work, we want to make it worthwhile for you to do this.
And do you think I serve on the Social Security panel over on Ways and Means Committee, the number of people choosing to retire at 62 is pretty striking. When you talk with them, the first answer that comes out is that, I don't know about the finances of Social Security in the future. I'm frankly going to access my benefits now while I can. Do you think that's a part of the thinking, rational expectations of a worker at that age?
I think that's actually, it's irrational expectations. I think that many people are thinking that. They say, I'm going to get it while I can get it.
Yeah.
The political reality is the chance of cutting benefits significantly for current retirees or near retirees is pretty small. The only way you could really do that is by cutting cost of living adjustments, and retiring earlier isn't going to fix that. So I think that's something where workers are scared and they're retiring early, when they really shouldn't do that. So I think we want it, by getting Social Security reform on the table and really discussing it, yes, it raises some tough choices that people don't want to think about, but it can also reassure people who are near retirement that we're not going to pull the rug out from underneath you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Biggs. Before I turn the question over to Mr. Mulvaney, Dr. Johnson, I know this is a little bit off topic, but since we've got you here, I'd like to ask you a question about a topic you've written a great deal about, too big to fail. Do you believe that Dodd-Frank has helped protect our economy from systemic risk, or simply made the problem perhaps even bigger, potentially more problematic?
Some parts of the Dodd-Frank financial reform legislation are steps in the right direction. I would point particularly to Title II, the resolution authority, which is being designed by the FDIC. I've worked with them on this, and I've helped with some of their outreach efforts. It's a tough technical problem, particularly dealing with cross-border issues for the global megabanks as currently structured. And there are a lot of political issues that would need to be overcome if you were actually to manage the orderly liquidation of one of these colossal banks, like a JP Morgan Chase or Bank of America, Citigroup, and so on. I do think we need to support the FDIC in this effort. I think it is very helpful to have Congress reaffirm the need for an orderly resolution mechanism. Relying purely on bankruptcy to handle these kinds of failures is not a good idea. That was the big lesson from the collapse of Lehman in the fall of 2008. I would also urge you to consider proposals that are now resurfacing with regard to reintroducing some version of Glass-Steagall. For example, Tom Hernig, who, as you know, is now the #2 person at the FDIC, is absolutely, I think, on target when he says large commercial banks of the kind that are essential to the functioning of this economy should not be allowed to have trading desks. They should not be allowed in any way to engage in speculative high-risk activities. Banking, that part of banking, should become boring. I think Mr. Herning is exactly on target. I work in part with Sheila Bair on some of these issues. I think she is exactly on target with regard to having much more equity capital throughout the financial system, particularly in these global mega banks. So all of this suggests we should move further. I hope we can move further on a bipartisan basis. I certainly hear plenty of Republicans as well as Democrats saying they are very worried about our existing financial structures. You should be worried. We should all be worried, particularly given the situation in Europe, the weakness of their big banks, and the connections through these black box of derivatives, in particular, to our very big banks that can absolutely damage our economy again, making the banks small enough and simple enough to fail, so then we can use bankruptcy for them, is absolutely the right goal to have as you consider future legislation on this issue.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Mr. Mulvaney?